In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this customizable rope with geometry nodes. And this is a product which I'm selling on the Blender Market and my Gumroad store and Patreon page and a few other online marketplaces. So if you'd like to purchase the product, I'll have the links in the description, or you can watch this tutorial and learn how to create it yourself. So first, I'm just going to show you how to use the product for everyone who's purchased. So the Blender file is going to come with this curve object, and the curve object has the geometry nodes applied to it. So here's the geometry nodes modifier, and the geometry nodes modifier has lots of custom values to control the rope. And then also here on the other side here, there is a customizable procedural material to control some values in the material. Now, if you want to edit the rope, you can go into edit mode of the curve and you can select the curve handles. You can scale the curve handles. You can rotate them and move them around. And you can also hit E to extrude out the curve handles. And then what you can also do is press Alt S. Alt S is going to change the size of the curve handles. And then what you can also do is hit the T key for the side panel. You can use the draw feature in the curves edit mode, and then you can also click on surface, and then here on the three little dots here you can change the offset. I've set it to 0.03 and I've chosen absolute offset, and this way you can just draw wherever you want the rope to be, and so that's going to generate a rope. So this would be a great asset if you're maybe modeling like a boat scene or an ocean scene. This looks like the kind of classic rope which would be on a boat or a pirate ship or something, but this rope of course has many uses. So now let's go over the geometry node customizable values. So there's this rope twist amount, so you can have the rope twisting more, or you can have the rope twisting less. Then there's also the rope resolution, so you want to turn the resolution down, you can if you have a lot of rope or you're looking at it farther away. Then there's also the strand size, so you can make those three different strands bigger or smaller. And then there is a subsurface, so if the rope is really far away and you don't need it to be that detailed, you could turn it down, or if you're looking at the rope closer up, you could maybe turn the subsurface up to like a 2, but the default is 1. Now if you zoom in closely, you can actually see there's some little threads kind of to make the rope look a bit fuzzy, and so the threads amount, it is going to make the viewport a little bit laggy if you turn it up really high, but you could, for the final render, turn it up to like 1,000 or even 2,000, so there's a lot more of that detail, those detailed threads. So if you look far away, you can see now there's a lot of threads there and it looks kind of fuzzy. But to make the scene faster in the viewport, I'm just going to leave it at 100, so it's a little bit faster in the viewport. Then there's also the threads thickness, so you can make those individual threads more thick or less thick. There's also the thread noise size, so you can see these threads are kind of jagged and random, so you can change the noise size there. And then there's also the threads distortion, so you can control how wobbly you want it to be. Then there is the threads detail, so you can kind of see, you can make them less detailed, more low poly, or more detailed. Then there's also the thread minimum size, and then also the maximum size. And there's also this threads length here, so you can make the threads really long or just make them really short. So then there's also a customizable procedural material for the rope. So we have the noise scale, that's just a little bit of noise over the entire material. Then we also have this noise detail level. Then we have the thread scale, so you can see there's that lines there, all those lines there for the threads. So there's the thread scale, there's also the threads distortion, and then also the threads detail. And then there's two different colors, so there's color 1, which is kind of those darker threads, and then there's color 2, which is the main color of the rope. And then there's the roughness of the rope, and then 2 bump strength. So there's the noise bump strength, which is just some noise over the surface to make it a bit bumpy. And then there's also the threads bump strength. So if you'd like to purchase the customizable geometry nodes rope, I'll have the links in the description to the product pages. But now we'll jump into the tutorial and I'll show you how to create it yourself. So here I am in a new scene in Blender, and I'm just going to start by deleting everything. So I'll now go to the add menu. I'm going to go here to curve, and I'm just going to add the default BZA curve. Now I want to model this better to the real life scale in Blender. And if I just add like a default cube here, the default objects in Blender are a bit larger than an average human. So you can see this rope would be pretty long. So I'm going to select this curve here and I'm going to scale it down, and I'll type in 0.2, and then I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale. So that's much better for using the real life scale in Blender. So now let's go over here to the side panel. We'll go to the modifiers. We'll click on add modifier and we'll add geometry nodes. We'll click on new to add new geometry nodes. And then I can just rename this to geo nodes rope. So now to actually start creating the geometry nodes setup, we're going to click here to go to the geometry nodes workspace. If you don't have a geometry nodes workspace, you can also click in the corner of any window and click and drag to split the window. And then you can click on the drop down here and change the editor type to the geometry nodes editor. So what I first want to do is create 3 different circles, and those 3 different circles are going to be what is going to be the shape of the length of the curve. So what I'm going to do is just make this smaller so we have more space here. So now let's go to the add menu, and I'm going to add a curve circle. So add a curved circle. Let's just drop this down here. And then if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit. You can go to the Preferences. And then over here on the Add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on. And it'll give us some shortcut keys to preview the nodes. So using the Node Wrangler add-on, I'm going to hold down the Shift and Alt key and then select a node. And so using the geometry nodes, if you Shift Alt select nodes, that'll preview just what that node is looking like. So you can see there is our curved circle. Now I want to make the circle lower topology because right now it's kind of high poly. So on the resolution, I'll just turn it to an 8. And then here on the radius, I'm going to turn this down to a 0.15, just a 0.15. So that's going to be a lot smaller, but that'll be better for modeling to the real life scale in Blender. So I'm going to press 7 on the numpad to go to top view so we can see this from the top view. And what I now want to do is have 3 different circles and have them offset. So there's one circle here, another circle here, and then another circle here. So it's going to be like a triangle. Now I could duplicate the curved circles, but I want to be able to control all the curved circles at once. And I also just want to use as few nodes as possible to keep the geometry nodes set up simple. So what I can do is I can search for the transform geometry node, and we're going to stick it right here in the wire. Then what I can do is press Ctrl-Shift-D. So Ctrl-Shift-D will duplicate the nodes, but it'll keep the wires plugged up. And then I'll press Ctrl-Shift-D again, drop this here. So we now have 3 transform geometries. And then what we'll do after we move the object around is we'll join them all up. And so it'll act as if there are 3 curves because we're transforming each one and then adding them both up again. So it'll be like there's 3 curved circles, even though we actually just have 1 node. So what I can do to preview that is I can select all of the transform geometries, and then I can press Ctrl-0. So Ctrl-0 will add the join geometry. Now it still just looks like there's 1, and that's because they're all on top of each other. But if I drag the X values or the Y values, you can see it's going to move it around. So I first want to drag this one up here. If I go to the second one, I want to kind of drag this one down and drag this one over, and I'll show you the exact number values that I'm using. But just to show you, if we drag all these values around, you can now see we're kind of getting a triangle with those 3 circles, and then we're joining them all together with the join geometry. So if you want to use the exact same values that I'm using, on the first one here, the Y is going to be 0.11, and then on the second one here, the X is going to be 0.09, the Y is going to be negative 0.07. And then here on the last transform geometry, the X is going to be negative 0.095. And the Y is going to be negative 0.07. So you can copy those values and add them in here to the X and Y axes if you want to get the same exact position that I'm using. Now I like to keep my nodes nicely organized so it's easy to understand what all the nodes are doing. So I will click and drag the box to select all these nodes. I'll press Ctrl-J to join them into a frame. And if you select the frame and press F2 to add a label, I'm going to call this rope strand or rope strands. And then if you want to, you can kind of compress the nodes down. If you want to just make it look a bit nicer, just like that. So now I have 3 transform geometries, and then they're all going into the join geometry. So now I want this geometry here to be going along the length of the curve. So to do this, we need to search for a curve to mesh node. So curve to mesh, drop this here. And then we want to take this group input, and this is going to be the actual curve data that we started with, and we're going to put that into the curve. So now we're turning the curve into a mesh. Now the profile curve is going to be the actual mesh shape of the curve. So we can take these circles and we can put that into the profile curve. So that's going to be the shape of the curves. So if we put the mesh now into the geometry, those circles that we created there are following the shape of that curve that we added. Now I also want to make the curves rotating, so let's add that. So I'm going to drag this down here, and this group input, I will drag it back, and we'll make the curves rotating right here. So we're going to go to the add menu, and we're going to search for a set curve tilt. We'll use the set curve tilt to actually tilt it. And also real quick, you can see that it's hollow inside. So back here on the curve to mesh, just click on fill caps. So it fills the caps there at the starting and the ending. So now the set curve tilt has this tilt value. And so if I turn this, you can see that's going to rotate the curve. However, instead of it being rotated all at once, I want it to be rotated at different points so that there's kind of that swirly shape. So to do this, I need to search for the index node. So we'll add the index node, and this will give us like the curve length data. So I can put the index here into the tilt. And this way you can see now it is rotating by a certain amount from this curve over here to this curve. And then if I extrude this out even more, you can see it's rotating a bit more, and then extrude out and you can see it's rotating a bit more. Now, the problem with this is that it's not rotating enough, so I want to tell it to rotate more. So what we need to do is we need to make it more detailed so that from like this point to this point, as it goes along, it's going to rotate a lot more. So to do this, we need to make it more detailed. So we're going to add a resample curve, and this is basically going to add more spaces within the curve. So we'll just drop this here. And now if I turn up the count, if I turn the count up more and more, you can see now it is twisting around, and that is looking a lot like rope. Now there is a problem with this, and that is that if I extrude this out really far, you can now see that it's not tilting quite as much, so I need to turn the count up. But then if I drag this back here and maybe have a small rope, it is tilting too much. So instead of it set to count, we're going to change it to length instead. And this way you can see as I pull it out, it's going to tilt it more, so it's not going to change depending on the size of the rope. So then here on the resample curve, the length here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.035. That looks pretty good, but you can change it to whatever you want. And this can also be added as a customizable value later in the tutorial. Now, if I zoom in here, you can see it does look a little bit chunky. So what we can do is add a subdivision surface. So if I go to the add menu, we're going to search for sub. We'll add the subdivision surface. This basically acts like the subdivision surface modifier, but it's a node, and we're going to put it after the curve to mesh. So now you can see it looks a lot smoother, and that looks way nicer. You can turn up the level, but I'm just going to keep it at 1 because 2 is a little bit high quality. I'll just keep it at 1 for now. And if you're working with this really far away, if it's just small in a scene, you could make it smaller, and that way there's not going to be quite as much detail. So the topology will be less. Now you can see if I zoom in here to the end, you can see that it looks really flat. So what I want to do is also search for the set shade smooth, and we'll put this after the subdivision surface, and now you can see that there is shaded smooth. So what we're going to do is box select these nodes, Control J to add a frame, and I'll select the frame and press F2 to give it a label, and I'm going to call this rope rotation because these nodes are rotating the rope around. And then also these nodes here, I will select all of them. These are controlling the geometry, add a frame, give it a label. I'm going to call this rope geometry, or you can also call it rope mesh or whatever you want to call it. So now let's make those little threads which are coming out of the rope, and it'll make it look a little bit fuzzy. So to make the thread, I'm first going to go to the add menu, and we want to search for some kind of object to start with. So I'm going to search for a curve line. We'll add the curve line right here, and then if I hold down the Shift and Alt key and select the nodes, that'll preview it. So you can see now if I look in the very center, we have this curve line, and the curve line is just being made up by a node, so there's not actually any geometry. It's just being made by the node. And we have the z-axis if we want to make it bigger or smaller, and then also there's a y-axis and x-axis to kind of move it around. So there's basically the start point and the end point, but I'm just going to leave it at the default. Now I want to distort it because right now it's just going straight up, but I want to distort it so it's kind of random. So to do this, we can search for a set position node, and we'll drop the set position after the curve line. And let's drag this over and drag this back so we have some more space. Now we need to add some sort of data into this offset here to kind of distort it. So what we're going to do to make it random is we're going to search for a noise texture, and we can put the noise texture factor into the offset. So now this is going to distort it. You can see if I change the scale there, it's kind of distorting that. But the problem with this is that there's only one point here and then another point here. And also it's jutting off to the side. I'll show you how to fix that in a moment. But right now there's just one point here and one point here, so it only has those 2 points to distort. So we need to basically subdivide it so that there are more chunks, and then those chunks can be moved around. So to basically subdivide it, we are going to search for a resample curve. And a resample curve is basically going to add more points to the curve. So we'll drop it after the curve line. So now you can see you can turn up the count, and you can make a very detailed curve with lots of little dots there. So there's 24. I'm just going to turn this down to a small number of 5. We'll just use 5. So now there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there. But now you can see there's some more points, and the noise texture can distort those points. Now you can see it's like moving off to this side. It's kind of being distorted over here, and it's not in the center. So to fix this, I'm going to add a mix color. We're going to put the mix color after the noise texture. And on the mix type here, we're going to set the type to linear light. Then we're going to take the noise texture factor, and we're going to put that into color B instead. And then here in color A, we're going to make this fully black. And then we can drag this factor, and you can see the factor is going to distort it, but it's not going to move it around. So it's going to stay here in the very center there of the 3D viewport, but it will still distort it. So I'm going to turn the factor all the way up to 1, so it's distorting it a lot. And then also here on the noise texture scale, I'll just turn this to 0.9, so it is a bit small. But the other settings I'll leave how they are. So now we can join these into frames. So we're going to box select these 2 nodes here, Control J. We'll box select these 3 nodes, Control J. We can just kind of drag these up here to compress them. So then this one here, I'll press F2 to give it a label, and I'm going to call this thread distortion. And then this one here, if I select it and press F2 to add a label, I'm just going to call this thread, because these objects here, they're making up the thread geometry, but then this group of nodes here is distorting it. So now we have this one thread here, but the problem with this thread is that it doesn't have any thickness, so you wouldn't actually be able to see it in the render. So I want to give the thread some thickness. So to do this, we'll go to the add menu, and we need to search for the curve to mesh, because you can't really see a curve object on its own. It needs some sort of mesh, some sort of faces. So we'll put this here, and we are still previewing the set position, so we can just drop the curve to mesh right here to preview it. Now we need some sort of profile, and the profile is going to be the shape of that thickness. So what's the shape going to be around the curve? So for this, we're just going to search for a curve circle. We'll put the curve circle down here, and the curve can go into the profile curve. Now it's really big right now, so we'll turn this radius down to make it much smaller, and now you can see the thread has thickness. So I'll turn this radius to a 0.04, so that's pretty good. And then also let's click on fill cap so that the top there is going to be filled. Now I want it to be thicker down here and then get thinner as it goes up. So we'll select these nodes and move them over, and we'll add in some nodes here so that it gets thinner as it goes up. So to do this, we'll search for the set curve radius, add the set curve radius and drop it here. Now right now there's just this radius, and this is one value which we can drag bigger and smaller, but what I can do is search for the spline perimeter node. Now the spline perimeter node has the data of how long the curve is in the starting and the end, so we can put the factor into the radius, and so now it's telling it that it'll be scaled to 0 here, and then it will be scaled up bigger to this number when it's at the top. Now the problem is that it's the wrong way around, so we need to flip it. So what we're going to do is search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp after the spline perimeter, drag this over here, and then we can switch the two values. So put the black over here and the white over here, and now you can see that it just gets smaller as it goes up. What I also want to do is click on the black tab here, and I want to make it a very gray color, like a subtle gray color, kind of like that. So it's not fully sharp, but it's just pretty sharp there on the top. And if you want to use the same hex value that I'm using for the gray color, you can punch in 6B, 6B, 6B here on the hex value. So just kind of that gray color. So let's box select all these nodes, join them into a frame, and I can just kind of compress the nodes down so it's a little bit nicer here in the node setup. We'll add a label, and it's going to be called thread thickness. And I totally forgot to save this Blender file, so definitely be sure to save it to Blender file. So click on File and Save. So we now have the single thread, and we want to put the thread on the rope. So to do this, we're going to search for two nodes. We're going to search for the distribute points on faces, and then we're also going to search for the instance on point. So drop this here. So what we want to do on the distribute points on faces is we want to put the curve data into this, and that way the distribute points on faces actually has the curve data, so it knows where to displace it on, or where to put the threads all around the curve. So we can put the set shade smooth, which is the rope geometry. If I shift alt and select it, you can now preview that. That is going to be the curve. So we're going to put the geometry into the mesh. Now if I shift alt and to select the distribute points on faces, you can see it's creating random points on the faces of this curve. So now the distribute points on faces points can go into the instance on points. So the instance on points is saying, what are the points? And the points are going to be these points here, which are along the curve. And so now what we can do with the instance on points is we can give it an instance, and the instance is whatever object is going to be distributed on each one of the points. So we can tell it that the thread is going to be distributed on each one of these points. So to do that, we'll put the thread thickness here, the curve to mesh. We're going to put this into the instance, and then I can control shift and select the instance on points. So now you can see wherever the points are, that is where a thread is going to show up. Now you can't actually see the curve, and that's because we need to add it back in. So what we can do is go to the add menu. We're going to search for the join geometry, and we'll put this here after the instance on points, and we can take the rope geometry and we can put that into the join geometry. That way we're adding back the original geometry, which was that rope curve there. So now there's some big problems with this. One thing is it's too big, and another thing is it doesn't have random rotations, so it's all just pointing up. So let's fix that. So you can see we have a rotation here, we can rotate them, and then we also have scale values. So first let's just make it a lot smaller. So I'm going to click and then drag down and then drag back and forth, and I'll just make them all a bit smaller. Just for now, I'll just scale them down to like that big. Now for the rotation, we can take the distribute points on faces rotation and we can put that into the rotation here on the instance on points. And why this is working, why this is making it distributed on all the faces, is because we took the face data here, we put that into the distribute points on faces, so now it has the rotation data for each one of the faces. Now I want to add more random values, so in between these two nodes, I'm going to search for the rotate rotation, and we'll stick this here. So we now have the rotation and the rotation, but now we have this extra rotate by value and we can add more rotations to this. So now I'm going to search for random value because I want to add random values to the rotation. So we can take the value and we can put that into the rotate by. But the problem with this is that we just have a minimum and a maximum value, but I want to be able to control the X, Y, and Z axis. So on the float here, we're going to change this to vector instead, and this will give us the X, Y, and Z values. So we can put the value back into the rotate by, and so now we have the X, Y, and Z values. So this Z value here, I'm going to turn this up to a big number, and that way it's going to be rotating around. So if I just click on all these and just turn them all to 0, I can now rotate this around, and you can see it's rotating all of them around. Now there is a problem with this, and you can see it's kind of offset. You can see it's not really rotating correctly. And also if I were to go into edit mode and rotate this up, so let's just rotate the rope up. Now if I try to rotate this, you can see instead of it rotating along this direction here, so the direction of that thread, it's rotating just around on the Z axis. And that is because we have the global turned on. So it's going to use the global X, Y, and Z, but I can change it to local instead. And this way it's going to use the local axis of each object. And now if I rotate this, you can see they're all rotating around by their local Z. Now, if I click on this value, I can type in TAU and hit enter. That is tau. So that's a math equation which generates this number, and that number is going to make sure that it's randomly rotating all the way around. Or if you wanted to, you could just make it a giant number like 1,000 or something, and that'll give it a random value. So now we also have the X and the Y, and that's going to rotate it along on those axes. So for those axes, I'm just going to turn them up to a small amount like a 2, but generally I do want them to go out and point away from the rope. So I'll just turn them up to a small number like a 2. Now I also want to control the scale here, and I want a random scale. So let's search for another random value node, and we'll put this down here, and the value can go into the scale. So this way, each one is going to be generated between these two values. So we have a minimum and then a maximum, and they're generated between them. So on the minimum, I'm going to go with a 0.02. And then here on the maximum, I'm going to go with a 0.08. So now they're going to be randomly generated between those two values. Now, there's not very many of them, so we can drag this density up to make more of them. And if you drag up a lot of them, if you have many of them, it might make the scene a little bit laggy. So for now, I'm just going to turn the density to 100. And that way there won't be as many, but then later when you're doing a final render, you could turn up a lot bigger, so there are a lot more threads. Now, if I take a look at these threads, I do think they are a little bit too big, so let's actually change these values a bit. So maybe I'll turn this to a 0.01, or maybe even a 0.05 on the max. I think that is a bit better size. So for now, I'll just turn the density to 100, so there's not very many of them, so it doesn't make the scene too laggy. So let's now join these all into a frame. So I'll click and drag to box select them, Control J, and then F2, and we will call this add threads because we are using these nodes to add the threads onto the rope. All right, and that is it for the geometry node setup. So I want to set up the lighting. So let's just go back over here to the layout, and I want to add it in HDRI. So I'll click here on the world properties, and I'm going to click on this yellow dot here next to color. I'll choose environment texture, and then I'll open in HDRI. And I'm just going to use this abandoned hall HDRI. I downloaded the 1K HDR version from Polyhaven, so a link will be in the description if you want to download the same HDRI. So I can go into the rendered view, just kind of see how that's looking. Let's also change the color management. So if I go here to the render properties, I'll use AGX and very high contrast there on the color management, so that looks a bit nicer. Let's also add a ground. So if I go to the add menu, I'll just add a plane. Let's scale the plane up. We can go to the materials. I'll add a new material. We'll just call this material ground. And on the base color, I'll make it fully black. And also maybe turn the roughness up to a 0.9 or maybe just a 0.8 so it's more rough. And then also if we go into edit mode, I want to just kind of select the curve here, maybe move the curve around, maybe delete that curve which is going up. Let's go to top view and I can extrude it. You can also hold down the control key and then click, and that is going to extrude it out to that point. So I can maybe just scale it and rotate it and just make an interesting looking rope, maybe make a pile of rope. All right, and maybe kind of rotate this over like that. Let's also add a camera. So if I go to the add menu, I'll just add a camera. I can move my view to where I want that camera to be, and I can press Control Alt Numpad 0 to bring the camera to where I am, and I'll just kind of move the camera around, something like that. Let's also add some light. So if I go to the add menu, I'll go here to light, and I will add an area light. I can move the area light up here and maybe rotate it over a bit. And let's turn up the power. So maybe I'll just turn the power up to 50 and then duplicate the light, maybe rotate it and have another light over here. So now we can add a material. So we're going to select the object. We'll go here to the shading workspace, and let's click on new to add a new material, and I can just call the material rope. Now you can see if I take the base color and try to change the color, it's not actually affecting the rope. And that is because we need to actually assign the material in the geometry nodes. So if we go back to the geometry nodes, we want to go right over here to the end of the setup. We'll go to the add menu and we need to search for a set material node. And because we want all the rope to be the same material, we're just going to drop this right here at the very end. And on the material, we can just choose the rope material. Let's press Ctrl S to save, and I'll go back to the shading workspace, and we'll now create this procedural material. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a wave texture because I want to have like some little threads there which are making up the strands of rope. Now, if I put the color into the base color just to preview that, you can see they're going in the wrong direction. And if I turn the scale up, that's not really fixing anything. If I try to change the X to Y or to Z, it's not really going to work correctly. And that is because it's all moving around in different rotations. And so that's not really going to look correct. So I'm going to change the Z back to X. And even if I select the wave texture and press Ctrl T to add a texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and even if I try to use the object coordinates or the UV coordinates, it's just not working correctly. So what we're going to do is delete these nodes, and I'm going to go back to the geometry nodes. So click here on geometry nodes, and we are going to give some data which is going to show us the direction of that chord or the curve there. So right here between the rope geometry and the rope strands, let's select these nodes and I can drag them back a bit. And right here, I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the capture attribute node, and we'll stick this here. So this will allow us to capture some data from the geometry nodes. Now I want to capture the movement here or the placement of where that curve is. So what I'm going to do is search for the spline perimeter node. We'll drop this here. We're going to put the factor into this here. So now it's giving us that data. So now to actually put the data into the shader nodes, we want to take this here, which is that factor, which is the spline perimeter. We're going to drag it over here and we're going to stick it into this value right here. So now that it's going into the group input, if you go here to the side panel, open these up, you want to go to the output attribute, and this is called factor. So right here it's called factor. So we need to name this factor so that we can add it in the shader editor. So if I click on this to rename it, I'm going to call it rope UV. So type in rope UV and then hit enter. You can really call it whatever you want. So make sure you use the same exact name. So remember what that name is called. So we're going to now go back to the shading. We're going to go to the add menu and we're going to search for an attribute. Now, if you click on the name here, we need to type the same exact name. So rope UV, make sure it's the same exact name. I can just take the vector here and put the vector into the vector of the wave, and now you can see it's going in the right direction. If I Control Shift and select it to preview it, you can see we kind of have this white and black values which are going around the rope. So if I Control Shift and select the wave to preview it, you can see now all those lines there are going along the rope. So let's Control Shift and select the principled shader again, and we'll change some of those wave settings. So we're going to leave this set to X. And I'm going to turn the scale here to 8. Let's also turn the distortion up to 45 so it's more distorted. And I'll turn the detail up to 5. And I'll leave the other settings how they are. So now we have that cool detail, the wave texture, and it looks like those little threads. So now we can put the wave texture color into the normal, but then to convert it to bump data, we want to search for a bump node and drop it here. And the color needs to be going into the height value to convert it to bump data. So it looks pretty bumpy now. And then on the strength here, let's just turn it down to like 8.4 so it's not quite as strong. Now also in the bump, I want to add a bit of noise. So let's go to the add menu. We're going to search for a noise texture and drop this here. And then with the noise texture selected, I'll press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And then I just want to use the object coordinates, so we'll put the object into the vector and we can just delete the mapping. So we'll drag this over here. So now this bump node, I can duplicate it and drop it here. And we can take the noise factor and we can put that into the height value to convert it to bump data. And then because this is outputting as a normal, we can put the normal into the normal of this bump. And that way we can mix multiple bump maps together. And then we'll change some of the noise settings. So I'll turn the scale to a 3.4 and I'll turn the detail up to 8 and I'll turn the roughness up to a 0.6. So now if you look closely, if I drag the strength value, you can see it looks nice and rough there. I don't want it to be too rough though, so I'm going to turn the strength just to a 0.4. But now you can see there's just a little bit of bump there on the surface. Now I also want to add some different colors there. So let's take the wave texture color and we'll put that into the base color. But then I don't want it to be white and black, I want to change the colors. So we'll go to the add menu and we're going to search for a mix color. We'll drop this here and we'll put the wave texture color into the factor. So this way the white values and the black values are going to determine what is going to be color A and what is going to be color B. So I'm now going to add some cool rope colors. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using for color A, you can punch in a hex value of 735529, and then here on color B you can punch in a hex value of CC9748. So that's really starting to look like a rope now. Now what I also want to do is make these creases and crevices a little bit darker, and that'll make it look a bit more worn and old and kind of make it pop out more and make the geometry look more 3D. So to do this, we can search for the ambient occlusion node. And then if I Control Shift and select the ambient occlusion node, you can see the creases and crevices are darker. Now I also want to click on the only local, because right now if it's turned off, it's going to interact with the ground plane, but I don't want that. So turn on the only local. So now you can see there's kind of this dark area there in the crevices. So we want to mix this into the base color to make it darker. So we're going to duplicate the mix here and we're going to drop it here after the first one. Now the ambient occlusion color, this can go into the factor to determine where the dark values are going to be. So now here in color B, this can be fully black. And let's Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now if I look at this, you can see there's a problem and the dark values are up here and the white values are down there. So what I want to do is add a color ramp to flip this. So we'll put a color ramp here after the ambient occlusion, and then I can flip these values. So I'll put the white tab over here and the black tab over here. And if I click on the color here on the black tab, I can turn it up a bit. And if I turn it up, it's going to be a bit darker. So I'm going to use this kind of dark gray color, and the hex value is going to be 393939. So if I Control Shift and select the mix here, if I Control Shift select between this one and this one, you can see here it is before and then here it is after. So it's adding that kind of dark area. So let's Control Shift and select the principled shader. Let's also go here to the roughness, and I'll turn the roughness up to 0.6 so it's a bit more rough. So that is it for the material. So later in the video, I'm going to be creating a customizable node group so you can customize the values. But first, we're going to be doing that for the geometry nodes. So let's click back over here to go to the geometry nodes workspace. And I'm going to be adding up custom values up to this group input here so we can control the geometry nodes on the side panel. One thing that I want to do real quick is just select these two nodes that we use to create the UVs. I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame. I'll press F2 to add a label. I'll just call this material UVs and hit enter. So now let's add up all the custom values for the geometry nodes. So let's drag the geometry right here, and we have this length here, and that length is going to control the twist amount. So we'll take the length, put that into the extra socket. If I hit the N key to open the side panel and go to the group tab, we can rename this. So if I click on the length here, let's double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to rope twist. So if I just click right here and close all these arrows here, we now have this rope twist, and I can drag this to control the rope twist. And then what I can do is plug all of them up to the group input, or I can press Shift D to duplicate and drop this here, and I can then plug up more values to this new group input. So I want to add the rope resolution. So you can see there's this curved circle, and this is being used to create the actual rope strand. So we have the resolution. So we'll put the resolution here into the extra socket, and let's double click on this to rename it. I'll call it rope resolution. And then also let's change the strand size here. So that's going to be changed by the radius of the circles. We'll put this into the extra socket, and I'll rename that to strand size. So now I want to take the group input and I'll duplicate it again. Again, you can use one group input if you want to, or you can duplicate them. And I'm just going to stick this maybe right here, actually right back here. And we have the subdivision surface, and I want to use this so you can control how detailed it is. So I'll put the level here into the extra socket, and I'll just call this subsurf. And then I will duplicate this again. Let's drag it over here, and on the distribute points on faces, we have the density. So I'll put that into the extra socket, and that's controlling how many threads there are. So I'll call this threads amount. Then I'll duplicate this again, and we'll bring it over here, and we have this curved circle, and we have this radius here, and that's changing the thickness of the threads. So we'll put this into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to threads thickness. Then I'll duplicate this again and drag it back here, and we can take this noise scale, put this into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to threads noise size. And then for the threads distortion, we can use this value here, the linear light. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket, and I'll call that threads distortion. And then also on the threads resample curve here, we have this detail or this count, and that's going to control how detailed it is. So I'll put the count there into the extra socket, maybe drag this back here, and I'll call this threads detail. Now I want to change the size of the thread, so I'll duplicate this again and drag it over here, and we have this random value here. This is going into the scale, so I'll put the minimum into the extra socket, the maximum into the extra socket, and I'll call this threads min size. And then this one is going to be thread max size. And then I also want to control the thread's length. So I'll just duplicate this one more time, or you could also use this one if you want to. And we have this curve line, and right here we have the Z value, which is going to control the size. Now if we put this end here into the extra socket, that would control these 3 values, but I just want to control 1 value. So I want to break up these values. So to do this, we're going to search for the combine XYZ node, and you can see this is 0 and 0 and 1. So we're going to leave these 0, but turn this to 1. Now the vector can go into the end here, so basically these 3 values are replacing these values, and now this Z value is going to change the size. But this is now broken up into 1, 2, and 3 values. So we'll put the Z into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to threads length. Alright, so now I'll hit the N key to close the side panel, and to make this look a lot nicer, you can see these geometry node group inputs are really large, so I'm going to select them, just hold down the shift key, and we're just going to select all of them, and with all of them selected, I'll press Ctrl H. So Ctrl H is going to minimize them, so you can only see the one which it's plugging into. And now I can just kind of make this look nicer, so I'll maybe drag this down here, put this down here, and this I can actually stick it into the node group. This here I could maybe just stick right down there, maybe bring this down, just so it's more nicely organized. So now let's just go back over here to the layout, and if I click here on the modifiers, you can see we now have all the custom values. So we have the rope twist, we have the rope resolution, we have the strand size, we also have the subsurface here, so don't turn that up too high or it will get too laggy. And then also this threads amount here, so you can turn that up to have more threads. Then also the threads thickness, the threads noise size, the thread distortion, threads detail, and then we have the minimum size and the maximum size. And for the minimum size and the maximum size, I think maybe just turning it down a little bit smaller might look a little bit better. So maybe even turning the max size to like a 0.03, that might look a little bit better. And then also the length of those threads. All right, so that's the geometry node setup. So now we're going to add a custom node group for the shader. So we'll go to the shading workspace, and we're going to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group. So now we'll hit the tab key to go out of the node group. Now let's drag this over here. Let's make it bigger. And I can copy the name, call it rope, and we'll paste it here into the node group. So I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group. I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And if I double click on that BSDF, I'll just rename that to shader. Now let's add up all the custom values. So the first value that I want to add is the scale of the noise. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and I'll put the detail into the extra socket. Let's rename these. So I'll rename this one to noise scale, and this one here I'll rename to noise detail. And then the wave texture is controlling the threads. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket, and also the distortion, and also the detail. And then I'll rename these. So threads scale, threads distortion, and threads detail. Then I want to add the custom colors. So we'll take color A, put that into the extra socket, and color B. And I'll rename this to color 1 and color 2. Then I want to control the roughness. So let's just take the roughness there, put that into the extra socket. That's called roughness. You could also put the ambient occlusion color if you want to into the extra socket, if you want to control that, but I'm not going to be doing that because I just want to leave it a black color. And then let's also add the bump strength. So this first one here is the noise. So I'll put that into the extra socket. This one let's call noise, bump strength, and then the last one here, put that into the extra socket, and this one is going to be threads, bump strength. So now you can hit the N key to close the side panel, hit the Tab key to go outside of the node group, and we can now just review this material, but I'm first just going to click on the modifiers. And so now we have the geometry node setup right here, and then we have the customizable shader right here. So we have the noise scale, then we have the noise detail, the thread scale, the distortion, and that detail. And then we have the two different colors, so colors 1 and 2. We have the roughness, and then we also have the noise and the threads bump strength. And again, you can purchase the finished project files on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, as well as the Blender Market. And purchasing the project files is a great way to help support this channel, and you'll have this customizable asset that you can use in your projects. Now, if you're interested in some more geometry node setups which are similar to this, then I have quite a few other geometry node modifier setups, like customizable Christmas lights, vines and ivy, some chain links, a customizable brick wall, and some more geometry node modifier setups. So you can purchase all those products. I will have the links in the description to some of my other geometry node products, and I also have tutorials on how to create them, so the links will be in the description. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thanks for watching.